He went missing at a baseball game, a normal afternoon, a crowded stadium. A father looks away for just a second, and his 7-year-old son vanishes without a trace. No screams, no clues, no goodbye. For 17 years, there was only silence. Until one ordinary day, at a homeless shelter in another state, a volunteer sees a face he swears he's seen before. On a missing child poster, almost 2 decades old. But before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? July 18th, 2006, a cloudless summer evening in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The sky burned in layers of tangerine and fading blue as the crowd poured into the PNC Park Stadium. You could hear the electric buzz of conversation, the clinking of beer bottles, the shriek of a child running after a foam finger, and the hum of the announcer echoing off the bleachers. The Pirates were playing the Cubs, but no one would remember the score. A father, David Carter, stood in line with his 7-year-old son, Mikey, waiting to buy a pretzel and a Coke. Mikey wore a bright yellow cap slightly too big for his head, and his tiny fingers clutched a souvenir baseball he'd brought from home. "I'll be right here," David had said, stepping forward to order. "Don't go anywhere, champ." And Mikey didn't. Not at first. But less than 2 minutes later, when David turned with napkins and a drink in hand, his son was gone. Gone, as if the ground had swallowed him. There were no screams, no struggle, no trail of dropped items. Just emptiness, a space where a child had stood moments before. Within 10 minutes, security was alerted. Within 30, the stadium was locked down. And within 12 hours, helicopters scoured the city skyline, reporters camped outside the stadium, and America's Most Wanted prepared a feature on the Carter boy. The nation watched, the family shattered, the father unraveled. No body was found. No witnesses stepped forward. No ransom was ever demanded. Michael Carter had simply vanished at a baseball game. 17 years passed. The world moved on. Seasons changed. New players wore old jerseys, and PNC Park hosted hundreds of games under new lights. But David Carter never stopped searching. He refused to sell Mikey's room. He refused to erase the last voicemail on the home phone. He refused to stop showing up every year at the same stadium entrance, holding the same photo, a 7-year-old boy with a crooked smile and a missing tooth. People called him broken, obsessive. A man stuck in a moment the world had already buried. But in a small shelter in Columbus, Ohio, 200 miles away, a volunteer named Elliot Ramos was about to see something that would make him stop mid-step. A new face, a quiet, withdrawn man who never shared his last name. He called himself Daniel. He didn't speak much, didn't eat much. But the way he clutched a crumpled pirate's cap in his jacket pocket, it felt wrong, like a ghost had carried something it shouldn't have. Ramos had been a police officer for 22 years before retiring. He'd seen enough to know that instinct mattered. So he walked over, knelt beside the cot, and asked gently, "Where are you from, Daniel?" The man didn't look up. He just whispered, "I used to be someone else." Inside a small office above the shelter's kitchen, Elliot pulled out an old file, a printed bulletin he'd kept from 2006. He unfolded the image. The boy in the photo had the same sloping eyebrows, the same shadow of a scar just above the left eye. He compared it again, this time to the man who now sat curled up in a corner, hair darker, face leaner. But the eyes, they were the same. The night air outside the shelter was cold for spring. Rain pelted the sidewalk, and a flickering street lamp buzzed overhead. Elliot picked up the shelter's landline and made a call he hadn't expected to ever make in his life. "Hello. I need you to sit down. I think I found someone you've been looking for." On the other end, David Carter dropped his coffee mug, and still the question lingered in the air like the echo of a forgotten melody. If this man really was Michael Carter, then where had he been for 17 years? And why didn't he remember? Or worse, What if he did? The last image. Elliot stands in the shelter hallway, watching Daniel sleep under a dim overhead light. In his hand, Elliot holds the tattered yellow cap, and beneath the inner brim, faded in marker, are the words, Mikey C. Long before anyone called him Daniel, he was just Mikey. Michael Thomas Carter, born March 19, 1999. A curious, baseball-obsessed 7-year-old with a tendency to wander and ask too many questions. He lived in a 2-story house on Fairview Street in Pittsburgh with his parents, David and Susan Carter. A modest home with a blue porch swing and a tiny tree in the front yard where Mikey once buried a plastic dinosaur so it could grow into a real one. He didn't like peanut butter. He loved elevators, he hated math, and every morning before school he insisted on wearing the same yellow pirate's cap, even if it clashed with whatever shirt he had on. Lucky hat, he'd say. Helps me think. David Carter, his father, worked in logistics. Quiet, methodical, always a little tired. He was the kind of man who didn't hug often, but when he did, it stayed with you for days. Mikey idolized him. He followed David around the house, carried his toolbox, mimicked his phrases. He even tried shaving once, with a popsicle stick and shaving cream, standing next to his dad in the mirror. They laughed for hours. Susan, his mother, was a school nurse, bright, cheerful, but always a bit anxious. She'd call home 3 times if Mikey had a field trip. She color-coded everything, from lunchboxes to socks. Mikey was her only child, her miracle. She'd had 3 miscarriages before him. She often said, "God finally gave me one I could hold." And she never let go, until she had no choice. The day Mikey disappeared, he'd drawn a crayon picture of the stadium before they left the house. It showed a stick figure with a baseball glove and a crooked, smiling sun above it. On the back, he scribbled in big red letters, "Me and Dad, today." That paper was later found in David's back pocket, soaked with sweat and rain, hours after the search had already begun. But this is not about a boy who went missing. This is about the man he became. And the question no one wanted to ask: what happens to a child who grows up without knowing who they are? Daniel. That's what they called him at the foster center in Toledo. He had no memory of his last name, couldn't recall his parents, only that he had once sat on something metal that moved up and down, an elevator, and that a man had called him Champ. That word echoed sometimes in his dreams. He was placed into care after being found wandering behind a bus depot in Zanesville, Ohio, at around 9 years old. Filthy, confused, barefoot, no one knew where he came from. When asked his name, he said Daniel, but that wasn't his name. No one ever figured that out. A social worker gave him the surname Jameson, after the street where he was found. Daniel Jameson, a ghost boy with no trail, no records, no birthday, no one looking for him, or so it seemed. Daniel bounced through 4 foster homes. Some were okay, one was not. He never liked closed doors, or the sound of glass bottles clinking, and he hated fireworks. They made him flinch, curl into corners, and cover his ears until his knuckles turned white. By age 16, he'd run away for good. He lived on couches, then park benches, then shelters. Sometimes he worked odd jobs, janitorial work, kitchen prep, warehouse shifts. He was quiet, polite, but always drifting. People forgot him as soon as he left the room, until he met Elliot Ramos, the man who noticed what others didn't. Elliot saw it the first time Daniel paused in front of the community room TV just as a sports channel replayed an old Pirates game. Daniel stood still, frozen. He stared at the screen with an expression Elliot couldn't place. Not nostalgia, not joy, not recognition, but something deeper. Like loss, like pain wrapped in static, like a home you barely remember and yet ache for without knowing why. That night, Elliot left a copy of a pirate's yearbook from 2006 on the break room table. It was an old one he'd picked up at a garage sale years ago. He watched from the hallway as Daniel picked it up, slowly flipped through the pages, stopping at a team photo taken at a fan appreciation event. Dozens of kids lined up with players. One child wore a yellow cap too big for his head. Daniel touched the image, didn't say a word. But his fingers trembled. It was that moment Elliot was sure. He pulled out the 2006 missing persons flyer from the old file cabinet. Mikey's eyes, a little wider, a little brighter, but still unmistakable. And that scar above the left eyebrow. Even after 17 years, it was there. Daniel didn't respond to questions about his past. He'd grown used to being asked, to shrugging, to saying, "I don't know." But when Elliot said the name Michael Carter aloud, Daniel's breath caught. He blinked, then whispered, that sounds like someone I used to be." In Pittsburgh, David Carter had aged more than 17 years. His hair was white, his hands trembled when still, but his eyes, sharp, focused, hadn't lost their fire. The moment he heard Elliot's voice over the phone, he didn't ask for proof, didn't ask for DNA. He only said, "Where is he?" They met 2 days later. Not in a stadium, not in front of reporters, but quietly in a chapel room behind the shelter with no one else around. Daniel sat with his back to the door, his hands folded like a child expecting punishment. David stood behind him, heart pounding. When Daniel turned, their eyes locked. It wasn't a cinematic embrace. There was no music, just silence. Raw, unbearable silence. Until David stepped forward, trembling, and placed a small object on the table. A plastic dinosaur. Faded. Chipped. "I dug this up last week," he said softly. "From the tree in front of our house. Thought maybe you'd want it back." Daniel stared at it. Then, for the first time in years, he cried. After David leaves, Daniel sits alone in the chapel. He turns the dinosaur over in his hand, and underneath, written in faded Sharpie, are the words, "Planted by Mikey. It will come back." But he doesn't remember writing it. Daniel hadn't spoken much since the reunion. After the meeting with David, he'd returned to his cot at the shelter, stared at the ceiling all night, and held the tiny plastic dinosaur so tightly it left imprints on his fingers. When Elliot asked if he wanted to go home, Daniel didn't answer. Not yet. Something didn't feel right. Something was missing. Or maybe something was buried. The next morning he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the scar above his brow. Where had he gotten it? David said he fell off a tricycle at age 5. But in Daniel's memories, or fragments of them, the scar came from something else. A fall, yes, but not in a driveway, in a basement. David had given him a box of belongings, salvaged from the attic after all those years. Inside, a baseball card collection, a framed photo of a smiling Mikey, gap-toothed, and holding a glove, a blue backpack with a broken zipper, and a crumpled, yellowed sheet of paper, the crayon drawing from the day Mikey disappeared. Me and Dad. Today. Daniel stared at the child's handwriting for minutes, then flipped the page over. There was something faint on the back, a word he hadn't noticed before, not written in crayon, but lightly etched in pencil. Run. He didn't tell David, not yet. The next few days passed in a fog of awkward silences, careful steps, and half-remembered dreams. Daniel agreed to visit Pittsburgh, but refused to stay at the old house. He chose a modest motel room near the Monongahela River instead, with a flickering lamp and carpet that smelled of mildew. He didn't unpack. He didn't sleep. He just watched and waited. On the second night back, he walked the old neighborhood at midnight. Fairview Street had changed. The tree in the yard was taller. The blue porch swing was gone, and the window to what was once his bedroom, now dark, boarded up, pulsed with a kind of silence that felt heavier than the night. As he stood there, an elderly neighbor emerged from a porch 3 doors down. She squinted. "Daniel?" she called. "That you?" He turned, confused. "It's me. Martha. I used to babysit you when your mama worked weekends." Daniel stepped closer. "You remember me?" She nodded. "Of course I do. You were the quietest boy I ever met." "And all was hiding." She paused, then added, "I told your daddy I didn't think that boy who vanished was you." Silence. "What?" Martha's face darkened. "I never believed it. That boy in the photo, he smiled too wide. You never smiled like that. Always afraid of something." Daniel's chest tightened. "And the day they said you went missing," she continued, "I saw you. In the alley behind the butcher's shop. I called out, but you ran." Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Did you tell the police?" "They never took me seriously. Said I was old, confused, but I know what I saw." That night Daniel returned to the motel and searched for Butcher Shop Fairview 2006. He found something else. A news clipping from July 2006. Local butcher's shop owner arrested in unrelated child abuse case. The article named a man, Richard Kinlan. The shop had closed shortly after Mikey's disappearance. Daniel's head pounded. His breath quickened. The scar above his eyebrow throbbed. And in the back of his mind, a door creaked open. A flash, concrete steps, a dark room, the smell of raw meat, a voice, "Be quiet, don't scream." Then, nothing. The next morning he confronted David. "Who was Richard Kinlan?" he asked, voice trembling. David froze. His hands clenched. "He was a monster," he said flatly. "We didn't know until after. He lived a few blocks from us, owned the butcher shop, had a record." Daniel stared. "Why didn't you tell me?" David looked away. "Because we thought maybe he took you." Daniel's chest ached. "Did you know him?" David hesitated. "We crossed paths once at a neighborhood meeting." The pause was too long. The answer too clean. Daniel didn't believe him, not anymore. Later that week, Elliot met with Agent Monica Green, the original investigator on the Carter case. She'd been skeptical about Daniel's identity, but the DNA test came back, a 99.998% match. Still, something about the case didn't sit right with her. Especially after what Martha said, especially after what Daniel found next. At the Pittsburgh Public Library, Daniel dug into microfilm archives. One headline hit like a hammer: "Local child found wandering, placed in foster care, no connection to missing boy case." Dated August 2007, Zanesville, Ohio. The child was described as roughly 8 years old, no identification, possible signs of trauma. But the report was buried, never linked to Mikey Carter. Daniel stared at the black and white photo. It was him. Same eyes, same scar. Why hadn't anyone made the connection? Why had it been ignored? He returned to Fairview Street, this time alone, this time at dawn. He stood behind the old butcher shop, now an empty lot filled with weeds and cracked bricks. He climbed over the chain-link fence, walked through tall grass, and there near the foundation, he saw it. A rusted metal door, partially buried. He pulled at it. It creaked open. Stairs led downward, steep, damp, and black. He descended. Each step echoed. Each breath grew colder. At the bottom, an empty concrete chamber. Chains on the wall. Stains on the floor. A child's drawing, barely visible, scrawled in chalk. A stick figure and a dinosaur. Daniel collapsed. He remembered everything. He stumbled out into the morning light, shaking, bleeding from the palms. And there, standing at the edge of the lot, was a man in a gray coat, watching. When Daniel turned to call out, the man was gone. Daniel didn't sleep for 2 days after discovering the basement. He sat in his motel room, facing the door, the plastic dinosaur in his hand. On the nightstand, the photo of Mikey, the yearbook, a sheet of notes with names and dates, and the rusted padlock he'd taken from the concrete chamber. He stared at it for hours. He didn't know why. But it felt familiar, heavy, cold, like it had been in his hand before. Elliot came to check on him. "You haven't been back to the shelter," he said gently. "People are worried." Daniel gestured to the cluttered table. "Something's not right. I remember flashes, but they don't match the story." "What story?" Elliot asked. "The one my father tells. The one the news told. The one I'm supposed to believe." Elliot sat beside him. "What are you saying?" "I think I didn't vanish. I think I was hidden." They began digging. Elliot reached out to old contacts, detectives, social workers, and cold case analysts. Daniel searched old maps, neighborhood blueprints, police records. He started to draw timelines, connect names, plot sightings. Patterns emerged. Richard Kinlan, the butcher, had no confirmed connection to Daniel's abduction, but there was more. He had a younger brother, Matthew Kinlan, now 58, no criminal record, worked in shipping for a decade. Matthew had once coached Little League. At the same time Mikey was playing, and his name had appeared, briefly, in the original Carter case files, but never followed up. Why? Because David Carter had said, "I don't know him." Elliot cross-referenced volunteer rosters from shelters in Ohio around 2007. He found something chilling. A man named M. Kinlan had signed in to donate clothing at a Zanesville shelter. One day after Daniel was found wandering near the bus depot, no one noticed it back then. Daniel traced the old foster home records. He found the name of a house parent, Sharon Peters, retired now, living in West Virginia. She remembered him. "You were always quiet," she said over the phone. "Didn't talk much, but you lined up your shoes every night, same way, and you cried in your sleep." "Did I ever mention anything about my past?" There was a pause. "Yes. One night you said, 'My daddy said to hide in the freezer if the door opens.'" Daniel froze. He called David that night. "Did you ever say that to me?" Daniel asked directly. "To hide in the freezer?" David's silence was loud. Then, "No. But it was a lie." Daniel remembered now. He was 5. David had taken him to a strange house. Said they were staying for a while. The house smelled of sawdust and meat. There was a freezer chest in the back, always locked. One night David had said, "If you hear the door and I'm not here, hide in there. Don't make a sound." Daniel hadn't known why. Now he thought he did. The Kinlan brothers had run a hidden trafficking ring. 2 confirmed victims. Only after Richard's arrest in 2007 did the rumors stop. But what if Mikey had been part of that network? And what if David knew? Daniel confronted Susan, his mother. He hadn't seen her since arriving. She'd been avoiding him, hiding even. But Elliot arranged a quiet meeting at her nursing home. Susan looked older than her age, fragile, faded. When she saw him, she gasped. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared. "You're alive," she whispered. "You're really here." Daniel sat across from her. "I need to know," he said. "All of it." Her voice broke. "I didn't know. Not then." "Didn't know what?" She took a shaky breath. "Your father owed people. Before you were born. He got clean, but the debts, they never left." Daniel leaned in. "Did he give me to them?" She shook her head. "Not like that. I think he took you somewhere safe. Then things got out of control. He lied to protect himself. And you." Daniel swallowed. "And you let him?" Susan closed her eyes. "He told me you died." That night, Daniel sat by the river. He played a voicemail from 2006. David had given it to him. "Mikey, it's Dad. We're going to have fun at the game today, all right? I packed your cap. Don't forget your glove. I love you, buddy. Always." Daniel replayed it again and again, then deleted it. He visited the old police precinct. Agent Monica Green met him outside. "I need access to the case files," he said. "You don't have clearance." "I'm the victim," she paused. "Not until the courts say so." He looked at her. "Then help me." She nodded. Inside the file room, they pulled the sealed box. Inside, photos from the day of the disappearance interviews, timeline logs, and one strange, never-investigated tip. A janitor at the stadium had reported seeing a man in a gray coat speaking to a child near the visitors' tunnel. The man wasn't on staff. Security tapes had no angle on it. The note was dismissed. No follow-up. Daniel circled the note. He had seen that man last week. Daniel returned to the motel and found his room had been searched. The yearbook was missing, the lock gone, the dinosaur shattered. There was no sign of forced entry. Only one person had the key, David. Daniel received an envelope under his door. No name, no return address. Inside, a photograph, black and white. A child gagged in a basement, eyes wide. On the back, not the only one. Daniel stared at the photograph in his hands, the one that had been slid under his motel room door. The child in the picture wasn't him, but it could have been. Same age, same fear in the eyes, same concrete basement walls. The caption on the back haunted him. Not the only one. The next morning, he took the photo to Agent Monica Green. She examined it, silent. This looks like one of the Kinlan brothers' victims," she said slowly. "But this picture was never part of the case file." Daniel leaned forward. "So who sent it?" Monica's face tightened. "Someone who wants you to remember more, or someone who wants to keep you quiet." Meanwhile, Elliot traced Matthew Kinlan's current address. It wasn't far. A cabin property 40 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, tucked in the woods near Slippery Rock. Registered under a shell company. No phone, no internet, no mail. But the land matched the soil type found on Daniel's shoes when he first entered foster care. Elliot didn't tell Daniel at first. He planned to go alone. On the drive out, Elliot left a voicemail for Daniel. "If I don't call back in 2 hours, send someone. Coordinates are in the glove box of my van." The cabin was old, rotten shingles, dead leaves everywhere. The windows were boarded, but the back door was ajar. Inside, silence, dust, a moldy mattress, a rusted heater, a broken typewriter. And on the far wall, dozens of photographs. Children, smiling, crying, sleeping. Polaroids, all dated, most from 2003 to 2007. Elliot felt sick, and then he saw it. In the center of the wall, a photo of Mikey Carter, smiling, yellow cap on, and next to it, one of himself, from 10 years ago. Footsteps behind him. Elliot turned. A man stood there, thin, gray coat, calm. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said quietly. Matthew Kinlan. The confrontation was quiet, chilling. Elliot tried to stall, asked questions, but Matthew wasn't afraid. "You think I took him?" he said. "I didn't." Elliot stared. "Then why is his photo here?" Matthew's eyes flickered. "I watched him, that's all. I was hired to watch." "Hired?" Matthew stepped closer. "Some fathers are willing to do anything to fix a mistake." Elliot didn't understand. Not yet. At the motel, Daniel received a package. No name. Inside, a VHS tape. A note. "This is the day before." He found an old player at a pawn shop nearby, hooked it up, pressed play, grainy footage, basement view, a child pacing, wearing a yellow cap. It was him. But then, another figure entered. A man, face mostly in shadow, voice distorted by tape quality, but the words were chilling. "Your dad said you like baseball. Maybe we can play catch later." Daniel froze the frame. The man wore a watch, silver band, black face. Daniel had seen that watch before, in a photo of his father. The day of the game. He confronted David the next morning. "I watched the tape," Daniel said. David didn't react, just sat down. "How long have you known?" Daniel asked. David whispered, "Since the first time I saw you again." "Why didn't you say anything?" David looked up, tears in his eyes. "Because I'm the reason you disappeared." And then the truth unraveled. David Carter was in deep debt in 2006, owed money to a private network of underground gamblers. He tried to run, but they threatened his family. One man, a handler, approached David with a solution: send Mikey away temporarily. A scare tactic, just a few days. They called it protective debt management. David agreed. They told him Mikey would be kept in a safe house. They told him he'd be returned. But the next day, everything changed. The handler vanished. The number was disconnected. No one answered his calls. David panicked, reported Mikey missing, but he couldn't admit what he'd done. Not to the police, not to Susan, not to himself, so he lied, and kept lying, for 17 years. Daniel didn't speak. He couldn't. The memories, the freezer, the whispers, the hands that held him down were all real. David stood, shaking. "I tried to get you back, I swear." Daniel looked at him. "You let me believe I was unwanted, forgotten. You let Mom break." David sobbed. "I lost everything. You gave me away." He left without another word. That night, David Carter took a bottle of sleeping pills. He survived, but was placed under psychiatric watch. Elliot called from the hospital. He'd been attacked. Someone had followed him from the cabin, broken into his van, left a note: "Stop digging." Daniel returned to the cabin with Monica. Together they tore it apart. In a locked chest, they found dozens of tapes, recordings, journals, ledgers, names, evidence of a trafficking ring larger than anyone imagined. But one entry stood out. Client 27, initial contact D. Carter, delivery date July 18th. The final twist hit hard. David hadn't just handed over Mikey. He'd initiated the contact. He chose the date, the place, the price. Daniel stood in front of the stadium 17 years later. He looked out over the field, then pulled from his pocket a small envelope with ashes inside. He scattered them in the wind. Inside were the burned remains of the yellow cap. He would never wear it again. The world knew his name now. Michael Carter, found alive after 17 years. It was on every screen, every paper. People used words like miracle, survivor, lost, and found. But Daniel, or Mikey, didn't feel found. He felt empty, not because he didn't know who he was, but because now he did. The media storm was relentless. Reporters outside the shelter, camera crews near the stadium, documentary offers, podcast interviews, news anchors crying on air. Daniel ignored them all. He stayed in a small guest room at Elliot's house. Curtains all was drawn. He barely spoke. He barely ate. He stared at the wall. On it he'd taped 3 things: the Polaroid of him in the basement, the ledger entry, Client 27, D. Carter, and a sticky note that read, "Was it my fault?" Susan Carter was moved to a secure care facility. She refused to speak to anyone but Daniel. He visited her. The room was white, sterile, humming with fluorescent light. She looked up as he entered. Smiled faintly. "I used to dream of this," she said, "of you walking through that door." Daniel sat down. "Mom," but she shook her head. "I know. You want to ask why I didn't fight harder, why I believed your father." He said nothing. "I was broken," she whispered. "He told me you were gone, that it was my fault, and I believed him because I wanted to." Daniel's throat tightened. "He didn't just lose me, he gave me away." Susan closed her eyes. "I know." They sat in silence for a long time. Then she reached into the nightstand and pulled out something wrapped in a handkerchief. Inside, a silver chain. At the end, a tiny locket, heart-shaped. Inside, a picture of Mikey, and a picture of Susan holding him as a baby. "I wore this every day for 17 years, she said. "I wanted you close, even if you weren't." Daniel didn't cry, but he took the locket and held it tightly in his palm. Monica Green filed the case with the DOJ. The trafficking network tied to the Kinlan brothers was larger than anyone expected. 3 more children were identified from the tapes, 2 still missing. Matthew Kinlan was arrested while trying to flee the state. He refused to speak. But during interrogation, he said only one thing. "You think I'm the worst thing in this story? Look closer." David Carter was moved from the psychiatric wing to a federal holding facility. He waived all rights, didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't speak at the arraignment. Daniel was allowed one visit. He almost didn't go. But something pulled him there. Closure, or maybe curiosity. David looked smaller, thinner. His hands trembled. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from the weight of living with himself. When Daniel entered, they stared at each other for almost a full minute. Then David said, "I wanted to be a good father." Daniel's jaw clenched. "You were supposed to protect me." "I know." "You paid them." "You signed your own son over like luggage." "I thought I could fix it. I thought I'd get you back." Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "I lived in silence. I ate from garbage cans. I forgot my name." David flinched. "I know," he whispered. "No, you don't," Daniel said. "You don't? You never will." He stood. "You don't get to be sorry. Not now." David didn't stop him. That night, Daniel sat outside with Elliot. A fire crackled in the pit between them. The stars above were scattered like glass. Elliot broke the silence. "When I lost my son, I kept his toy truck. It sat on my desk for years." Daniel looked up. "What happened to him?" Elliot exhaled. "Cancer, age 4. It was quick, but not painless." Daniel nodded slowly. "You think I should forgive him?" he asked. Elliot shook his head. "I think you should forgive yourself." Daniel didn't sleep that night. Instead, he packed a small backpack. The next morning, he left a note for Elliot. "I need to go where it started, to remember who I was, and decide who I want to be." He caught a train to Zanesville. The bus depot was still there. Same cracked pavement, same rusty bench, same blinking light over the platform. Daniel sat there for an hour. He remembered the shoes he wore that day. Too tight. The sandwich he'd thrown away. The woman who asked, "Where's your mother?" He hadn't answered. Now he whispered, "Gone." He walked to the shelter where he was first placed. Different staff now, different children, but the room was the same. The mattress on the floor, the scuffed walls, the small window with the humming AC unit. He lay down, just for a minute, and the memories came. All of them. He remembered the way Richard Kinlan smelled like cigarettes and soap, the hiding games that weren't games, the freezer, the whispers, the quiet screams. But he also remembered the night he ran, the truck stop he hid behind, the dog that licked his face until he laughed, the woman who said, "You're safe now." He had saved himself. Daniel returned to Pittsburgh 1 week later. He walked into the police station and handed Monica Green a notebook. Inside were names, faces, details only a survivor could know. "I want to testify," he said, "not just for me, for them." The trial was brutal. David Carter was sentenced to 25 years. Matthew Kinlan received life without parole. Susan passed away 3 months later, peacefully, in her sleep. Daniel was at her side. Elliot helped Daniel find an apartment, small, quiet, overlooking a park. Daniel applied for a community college, sociology major. Focus, child advocacy. One day, a letter arrived in the mail. No name, no return address. Inside, a ticket to a Pirates game. And a note. Maybe it's time to see how the game ends. Daniel smiled. He didn't go. But he folded the note, placed it in the locket with his photo, and closed it. As he sat on a bench, a boy passed by chasing a baseball. Daniel stood, called out, "Hey, you dropped this." The boy turned, smiled, ran back. Daniel handed him the ball. The boy looked up. "You like baseball?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I used to." Spring rolled into Pittsburgh with a kind of quiet Daniel had never noticed before. For years, the city had been just a blur in his memory. Stadium lights, echoing chants, the taste of soft pretzels. Now it felt slower, more alive. As if every corner carried both pain and healing, waiting for him to choose which to see. He began walking every morning, no destination. Just the hum of life around him, the smell of coffee shops, the clatter of buses, the chatter of people who had no idea what he'd endured. Sometimes strangers would glance at him, as if they recognized his face from a headline, but mostly he was invisible, and he liked it that way. Elliot visited often. "You're quieter these days," he said one afternoon, sipping black coffee on Daniel's porch. "I'm thinking," Daniel replied, "about what comes next." Elliot smiled. That's the right question. For years, Daniel's life was defined by what was taken from him, his family, his name, his childhood. But now he realized that surviving wasn't the end of the story. Living was. The first time he returned to PNC Park, it wasn't for a game. The stadium was empty, a weekday afternoon tour. The seats looked smaller than he remembered. The air smelled faintly of turf and popcorn, ghosts of cheers lingering like echoes. He stood where he last saw his father, the pretzel stand, now remodeled. He closed his eyes. A single image flashed, his father's hand letting go of his. He opened his eyes, steady. "I'm not that kid anymore," he whispered. At home, Daniel started writing, not a memoir, at least not yet, but pages filled with memories broken and stitched together. He wrote about the small details no one cared about, the sound of chalk scraping on a basement wall, the metallic taste of fear, the way sunlight felt like a stranger after months in darkness. Sometimes he wrote about forgiveness, sometimes about rage, but mostly about survival. One evening, Elliot brought over an old cardboard box. "Thought you might want this," he said. Inside, Mikey's original glove, a signed Pirates program, a ticket stub from July 18, 2006. And the yellow cap. What remained of it scorched at the edges from when Daniel burned part of it during his moment of anger. Daniel lifted it gently. "I thought I was done with this," he said. "Maybe you are," Elliot replied, "or maybe you're ready to remember it without letting it own you." Daniel didn't respond. He just placed the cap back inside the box, not to bury it, but to keep it safe. Weeks later, he attended a support group for survivors of abduction and trafficking. At first, he just listened. Stories of kids who were found, kids who weren't, parents who searched for decades, siblings who still left an empty chair at family dinners. Then, one night, he spoke. "My name was Mikey Carter," he said, voice trembling, "but for years I didn't have a name. I was just no one. And I thought that meant I didn't matter." He paused. "But I do. We all do, because we survived." The room went quiet, then warm. Someone reached for his hand. Daniel's life didn't become perfect. He still had nightmares, still flinched when doors slammed, still avoided July. But he also started smiling, small, unplanned smiles that felt like sunlight after a storm. In early autumn, he visited his mother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, leaves rustling like whispers. He knelt, placing the silver locket on the headstone. Inside, a photo of both of them, forever frozen in a moment before everything fell apart. "I'm still here, Mom," he said softly. "And I'll keep going." He stayed until sunset. As for his father, Daniel chose not to visit. Not yet. Maybe never. Forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about letting go of the weight David left on his shoulders, but he wasn't ready to drop it. Not yet. On the last page of his journal, Daniel wrote a single line. "The boy I was went missing, but the man I became found him." He looked out over the city from Elliot's porch that evening. The streets buzzed with life. Kids laughed, someone played guitar, and a radio hummed faintly from a neighbor's window. For the first time, Daniel felt like he belonged, not to the past, but to this moment. And as he closed his eyes, he thought of that little boy in the yellow cap, standing at a baseball game, smiling because the world was still simple and safe. Maybe in some way, that boy was still there. Maybe he always would be. Life doesn't always give back what it takes. But sometimes it gives you something else, a second chance, a new name, or the courage to look at the scars and say, "I'm more than what happened to me." He went missing at a baseball game, but what truly disappeared that day was a childhood. And 17 years later, what was found wasn't just a boy, it was the strength to live again.